I sat on a wooden bench outside St. Augustine Medical Center, my hands clenched so tightly in my lap they'd gone pale. The soft clatter of Charleston's harbor life echoed faintly in the distance, gulls crying, boat horns groaning. But all I could hear was the static hum of fear in my chest. The spring breeze smelled faintly of sea salt and camellias, but none of it reached me. Not really. Not while my husband, Mason, lay somewhere behind those sterile hospital walls, too weak to speak, too proud to admit how scared he was. I was a pediatric nurse. I had seen my share of emergencies, families torn apart, loved ones clinging to hope. But nothing prepares you to be the one sitting on the bench, when the person inside is your whole world. Mason used to be unstoppable. He built boats with his hands, handcrafted every curve of wood with pride and precision. The kind of man who'd spend 10 hours under the sun restoring a vintage sailboat and still come home to cook us lemon pasta, barefoot, music playing from his old radio. He had this grin, lopsided and boyish, that could melt away even the worst kind of day. But now he was wasting away. 6 months ago, he brushed off the bruises, the fatigue, the coughing fits. "Just a bug," he said. "Been working too hard." We laughed it off, but the blood work told a different story. A rare autoimmune condition. His bone marrow had stopped producing blood. Without a stem cell transplant, they said. They never finished the sentence. I tried to be strong. God, I tried. I held his hand when they inserted the central line. I kissed his forehead after every blood transfusion. I whispered, "We'll get through this," even when my knees buckled in the hallway. But I knew the truth. He didn't have family, no siblings, no parents. Mason had grown up bouncing between foster homes with no name to trace, no medical history, no one to turn to when the doctors said the only way forward was a perfect donor match. The registry was a long shot, the kind of odds that felt more like a countdown than a cure. That morning, the hematologist pulled me aside. "Claire," he said gently, "we're running out of time." I nodded like I understood, but I didn't. I couldn't. I needed air. I needed space from the beeping machines and the soft-spoken condolences of strangers. I stepped outside and sank onto the bench, tears blurring the sunlight into smeared streaks. That's when I heard it. 2 hospital custodians passed nearby, talking in low voices. One of them, a younger guy with a mop in his hand, said, "You seen that guy in room 218? Looks just like that boat guy out in Wren's Bay. Real quiet fella. Works with old marine scrap." I didn't move. My breath caught. Wren's Bay. That was nearly 2 hours away. A guy who looked like Mason? Maybe it meant nothing. Or maybe it meant everything. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in a stiff chair by Mason's hospital bed, his pale hand resting in mine, the machines humming steadily around us. His breaths came light, shallow. I watched the rise and fall of his chest and tried to memorize everything. The curve of his lips, the roughness of his knuckles, the freckles along his jawline that always darkened in the sun. I was terrified of forgetting. 6 years ago, I met Mason in the middle of a storm, literally. A hurricane had just swept through the South Carolina coast, and I'd volunteered for a community medical unit in a fishing village near Beaufort. The power had been out for days. Everyone was exhausted. He came in with a gashed hand, his shirt soaked with rain, smelling faintly of salt and pine and diesel. "Caught it on a rusted chain while salvaging a motorboat," he muttered. He barely winced as I stitched him up, more annoyed at losing a day's work than the blood dripping down his arm. But he smiled, just once, and it stuck in my mind for days. 3 weeks later, I saw him again outside a bait shop with a cup of black coffee and a dog-eared notebook filled with boat sketches. We talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing. About how he loved restoring wooden vessels, how I always wanted to work in pediatric trauma, how we both hated traffic but loved the sound of rain on metal roofs. He made the first move. He showed up at my apartment with a piece of driftwood carved into a small dolphin, said, "It's not much, but it's yours." That night, we sat on the floor and ate takeout in silence like we'd known each other forever. That's who Mason was. Not loud, not showy, just present. Thoughtful in ways that felt like balm to an aching world. After we got married, we bought a fixer-upper near the marsh, a slanted old cottage with rotted steps and shutters barely hanging on. Mason rebuilt that place board by board. He crafted me a wooden window bench so I could read in the sun. For our anniversary, he made me a rocking chair. I cried when I saw it. We tried for children. We tried so hard. But the tests came back empty, and the doctor's face turned solemn. IVF. Medications. Shots. 2 failed cycles. The hollow ache of loss. One night I broke down. I sobbed into his chest, saying, "You deserve someone who can give you a family." He cupped my face and whispered, "Claire, I didn't marry a womb. I married you. You are my family." That was the kind of love Mason gave. Quiet, fierce, unshakable. And now, as I looked at his face beneath the oxygen mask, I knew I had to try. Whatever Wren's Bay meant, whatever shadow of a chance that stranger held, I had to follow it. I had to fight for him the way he had always fought for me. By dawn, I had packed a duffel bag, printed Mason's most recent photo, and filled my gas tank. I left a note with the ICU nurse, asking her to call me if anything changed. I didn't tell Mason I was leaving. He was too weak to argue, and I couldn't bear the way his eyes would search mine for answers I didn't yet have. The road to Wren's Bay was quiet and winding, lined with fog-draped trees and stretches of low country marsh that shimmered in the early morning light. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, the silence in the car interrupted only by the occasional hum of the tires over old pavement. I didn't have a name. I didn't even know if the man existed. All I had was a whispered rumor and a desperate heart. The town of Wren's Bay felt like something out of a postcard. Weathered docks jutted into murky waters. Boats bobbed gently. Locals chatted near the bait shop. Teenagers rode bikes along cracked sidewalks. It was the kind of place where no one was in a hurry. And yet I was racing the clock. I started with the marina. "Excuse me," I said to an older man who was loading crab traps onto a skiff. "I'm looking for someone. I don't know his name, but people say he looks like this." I showed him the photo of Mason. The man adjusted his cap, squinting at the image. "Looks like Ethan," he finally said. "Ethan Walker. Keeps to himself. Lives off-grid out near the old ship graveyard. About 10 minutes past the inlet bridge down a gravel road. You'll see a rusted buoy by the driveway. That's his." My heart jumped. "Does he have family here?" The man shook his head. "Nope. Grew up rough, moved here a few years back. Doesn't talk much, but he's good with his hands. Salvages old hulls, repurposes them. Hell of a craftsman." "Ethan." My hands trembled as I thanked him and returned to my car. 10 minutes later, I turned onto a road barely wide enough for a single vehicle. Pines towered on both sides, their shadows stretching long and thin. The gravel crunched beneath my tires. Then I saw it. A rusted red buoy hanging from a tree branch, swaying lightly in the breeze. The house beyond it was small, weathered, surrounded by tools, boat scraps, and the skeletal frame of what might have once been a schooner. It looked like a place that belonged to someone who had lived alone for a long, long time. I stepped out, heart racing, and walked to the porch. My knuckles hovered over the door. Then I knocked. Once, twice, a pause. Then the door creaked open, and I saw him. Tall, broad-shouldered, slightly unshaven, and when he looked at me, I forgot how to breathe. Because it was like Mason was staring back at me. The man stood in the doorway, his hand still gripping the edge of the frame like he was ready to shut it again if I said the wrong thing. His face was older than Mason's, weathered from the sun, with deep lines carved by time, but the resemblance was haunting. Same jawline, same eyes, same subtle tension in the shoulders, like he was used to bracing for bad news. "Can I help you?" he asked cautiously, his voice low, rough like sandpaper but steady. I swallowed the lump in my throat and held out my phone with trembling fingers. "My name is Claire Thompson," I said. "This is my husband, Mason. He's in St. Augustine Medical Center in Charleston. He's dying, and someone told me you look like him." He stared at the photo, his brows furrowed. He blinked slowly, once, twice. His fingers brushed the edge of the screen. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he murmured, "I'll be damned." "Do you know him?" I asked. "No," he said quietly. But I think I know who he is. He stepped back and opened the door wider. You'd better come in. The inside of the house was sparse, functional. Wood floors, a couch that had seen better decades, coffee brewing on an old steel percolator, boat blueprints tacked to the wall. I sat on the edge of a battered armchair, still clutching my phone, still trembling. My name's Ethan Walker, he said, sitting opposite me. I don't know your husband, Claire, but I think he might be my brother. I stared at him. I was 5 when my mother had another baby, he said. We were living in a shelter outside of Raleigh. She was addicted. She barely knew how to feed me, let alone take care of a newborn. I remember she wrapped him in a towel and handed him to a nurse, just like that, signed some papers and walked out the front door. She told me, forget him. He's not your problem. But I never did. My throat tightened. Mason never knew his family. He was abandoned at a clinic in Charleston. No name, no record. Just placed into foster care at 3 days old. Ethan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. That lines up. My mother disappeared not long after. I bounced between homes, aged out, and kept my head down ever since. Never tried to find him. I leaned forward. Ethan, Mason needs a bone marrow transplant. He has no family, no match. He's dying. I came here hoping... He didn't let me finish. I'll get tested, he said immediately. If there's even a chance I can help him, I'll do it. Tears burned behind my eyes. Are you sure? Ethan nodded. You don't walk away from blood. Not twice. We drove back to Charleston that night in separate cars. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half afraid Ethan would vanish if I blinked. But his headlights stayed with me, steady and unwavering, all the way to the hospital. The next morning, the doctors ran a full compatibility test. That afternoon, the hematologist stepped into the waiting room with cautious hope in her eyes. She looked at me, then at Ethan. You're a strong match, she said. One of the best we've seen in months. I gasped, my hands flying to my mouth. Ethan's jaw clenched. His eyes shimmered with something close to disbelief. When can we start? He asked. We'll begin prep immediately, the doctor replied. Time is critical. It felt like we had just cheated fate. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to exhale. Mason had a real chance, a future. A miracle had walked through the hospital doors in worn boots and calloused hands. But the miracle didn't stay long. That night, Ethan disappeared. I returned from grabbing coffee and his cot was empty. No bag, no note. No one had seen him leave. Panic flooded me. I checked the lobby, the visitor logs, the parking garage. I begged security to check the cameras. The footage showed Ethan speaking briefly with a man in a dark gray suit in the hallway near the stairwell. Then, he was gone. My stomach dropped. I called the number Ethan had written down earlier. Disconnected. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The next morning, desperate, I went through Ethan's backpack, which he'd left in my car. Tucked deep in a zipped side pocket was a sealed envelope. It wasn't addressed. I tore it open. Inside was a photocopy of a federal document marked confidential and a short handwritten note. The document revealed that Ethan Walker had been placed in a witness protection program 6 years ago under a sealed court agreement. He had testified against a smuggling ring that trafficked stolen medical equipment through Charleston's ports, a crew with ties to organized crime. His cooperation had helped bring down a major player and nearly cost him his life. He'd vanished under a new identity into Wren's Bay. The note was scribbled hastily. Claire, I didn't run. I was removed. They said exposure now could undo everything, but I couldn't walk away. I signed the waiver, no more protection. I'll find my way back. Mason deserves to live, even if I don't get to see it. Tell him. Tell him he wasn't forgotten. Ethan. I pressed the note to my chest, trembling. He had risked everything. His freedom, his safety, his name, to try to save Mason. I didn't know where Ethan was now. I didn't know what would happen next. But hours later, just before the scheduled procedure, a nurse walked into the prep room with wide eyes and whispered, "He's here." I I turned, and there he was. Ethan stood in the doorway, calm and pale, his eyes locked on mine. "I signed away everything," he said quietly, "but I won't sign away my brother's life." The surgical team moved quickly. Time was precious, and Ethan didn't flinch. Not once, as the nurses inserted the IVs and explained the procedure. He cracked a small smile at one of them and said, "I've had worse." But I saw the tension in his shoulders, the weight behind his eyes. He wasn't afraid of the pain. He was afraid of disappearing again. Before they wheeled him in, he reached for my arm. "Claire," he said softly, "if this goes sideways, don't tell Mason about the rest. Let him just think I was someone who showed up when it mattered." I gripped his hand. "You're more than that. You're his brother. You always were." He blinked fast, nodded once, then followed the nurse down the hall. The next several hours were the longest of my life. I sat in the quiet waiting area with nothing but a styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee and Mason's wedding ring looped around my finger. The machines beeped behind double doors, and I prayed with every breath I had. Finally, the lead doctor appeared. Her face was lined with exhaustion, but she smiled. Procedure went smoothly. The transplant was successful. Mason's body accepted the cells without immediate complications. I sank to the floor, sobbing, not from fear this time, but from a release so deep I didn't know I'd been holding it. Mason remained sedated for another day. When he finally woke, he was groggy, but aware. I sat by his bed, brushing his hair back as he slowly focused on my face. "Claire," he whispered. "Is it real? Am I still here?" I nodded, pressing a kiss to his hand. "You're here, baby. You're going to be okay." He swallowed hard. "Did we find a match?" I hesitated, then nodded again. "Yes. You had someone watching over you after all." He closed his eyes, and a single tear rolled down his cheek. I didn't think anyone would ever come. Later that evening, Ethan walked into the room, pale and tired, but standing on his own 2 feet. Mason's eyes widened. The resemblance wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something rooted in the way they both looked at the world with quiet strength. Ethan offered a small wave. "Hey." Mason's voice cracked. "You're real." "I am," Ethan said, pulling a chair beside him. "And I'm not going anywhere. Not unless someone makes me." The 2 men locked eyes. Mason reached out a trembling hand. Ethan took it without hesitation. There were no speeches, no dramatic tears, just silence, and the weight of something whole being restored. And in that moment, I knew. This wasn't just a life being saved. It was a family being found. Recovery was slow. Mason spent 3 more weeks in the hospital, his body adjusting to the new marrow, the new chance. Every morning, I would check for the tiniest signs. A steadier grip, a hint of color in his lips, less trembling when he reached for his water glass. Every improvement, no matter how small, felt like a victory. Ethan stayed close. Sometimes in the waiting room, sometimes by Mason's bedside when hospital policy allowed it. He never asked for anything, never made a scene. He just showed up, quietly, consistently. Mason called him my shadow the first time he saw him asleep in the hallway chair. "He's always there," Mason whispered to me one night, his voice still weak. Like he's trying to make up for years neither of us remember. I smiled. Maybe he is. When Mason was strong enough, we returned to our little cottage by the marsh. The house felt both familiar and different. We had left in fear. We came back with hope. Ethan followed behind in his pickup truck. We had offered him a guest room, but he insisted on staying in the refurbished garage for now. "Feels more like home," he said with a shrug. Truth was, I think he didn't want to intrude. But every evening, he joined us for dinner on the porch. He and Mason would talk about boats, tools, music, childhood flashes that might have been real or imagined. One night, Mason disappeared into the garage and came back with a narrow box wrapped in burlap. He handed it to Ethan without a word. Ethan unwrapped it slowly, and inside was a handcrafted shadow box, lined with blue velvet, containing 2 matching pieces of driftwood carved into twin figures. On the bottom was a small brass plaque. Brothers, by blood, by choice, by grace. Ethan didn't speak. He just reached out and pulled Mason into a hug so raw and quiet that I turned away, blinking tears back before they could fall. A few days later, something strange happened. We received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a small brass compass with the letter W engraved on the back. Mason turned it over in his palm, studying the etching. "My father had one just like this," he said. "He used to keep it in his fishing vest. I don't remember much, but this feels right." We never found out who sent it, but Mason placed it on the fireplace mantel that same evening, a symbol of something returned, or maybe something finally found. Ethan stayed through the winter. Eventually, he bought a plot of land down the road, began sketching plans for a boat workshop of his own. "Something small," he said, "but with enough room for 2 pairs of hands, just in case." Life didn't look the way we once imagined. It was better. It was deeper. It was real. Spring returned to Charleston like a quiet promise. The marshes shimmered in the morning light, and the air was thick with wisteria and salt. On a Sunday afternoon, Mason and I sat on our porch, just as we used to, in the rocking chairs he had built before his diagnosis. Only this time, something was different. He reached for my hand and placed it gently over my stomach. I smiled. After everything, the failed cycles, the dashed hopes, the grief, I was finally pregnant. Naturally. Unexpectedly. Miraculously. "I don't know how," I whispered. Mason just looked at me with that same crooked grin that had pulled me in years ago. "Maybe it's not about how. Maybe it's just about when." Inside, the old house smelled like cedar and fresh bread. Ethan had just left to meet with a contractor about his new boat shop. He'd built a small dock behind our property where he and Mason worked side by side some mornings. No words, just tools and wood and a quiet rhythm of understanding. Sometimes I'd catch them laughing at something small, an inside joke, a memory half-formed. Other times, they sat in silence, like the connection between them didn't need filling. One evening, we drove out to Wren's Bay again. Ethan wanted to show Mason where he'd lived all those years. The shack was still standing, the rusted buoy still swaying in the breeze. But now there were flowers along the porch, and a new mailbox with both their names carved into it. The town welcomed Mason like he'd always belonged. People remembered Ethan. Some even mistook them for each other. A child tugged on Mason's hand, calling him Uncle Ethan, and we all laughed until tears came. That night, around a bonfire in Ethan's backyard, we sat with mugs of cider and watched the flames flicker. The stars blinked awake, one by one, and the quiet wrapped around us like a blanket. Mason turned to me and said, "You know, I used to think being abandoned meant I'd always be broken, always searching, but now I don't feel lost anymore." "You were never lost," I whispered. "You just hadn't been found yet." He squeezed my hand. I looked around, at the firelight dancing across Ethan's face, at the rocking chair Mason had restored for our nursery, at the compass resting in his coat pocket, and I felt something settle deep inside my chest. Peace. Because life didn't just give us survival. It gave us something bigger. A second chance. A brother found. A child on the way. A life reassembled from the ruins of fear and silence. And if there was one thing I had learned through it all, it was this. Family isn't defined by the people who never left. It's defined by those who choose to show up when it matters most. Even if they come late. Even if they arrive in the middle of your storm. Sometimes, that's exactly when you need them. And sometimes, that's when the healing begins.